Brock Hart. He's our next keynote speaker. Brock, are you camera and microphone ready?
Yes.
There you are. So thanks for joining us. As you've just been listening, Ross has just been speaking a little bit about the sector specifically. But of course, this is a design challenge. And so the, I guess, problem-solving strategy that we're using in relationship to helping these businesses address COVID in the wilderness tourism sector is design. And so you've very graciously agreed to come and I guess in some ways represent design and a career in design. I'm just going to quickly introduce you, and if you're up for it, we'll get you to share your screen so you can control your own slides, and we'll set you free. And just like with Ross, we'll have your presentation and then we'll have a few minutes for questions and answers at the end.
Awesome.
Great. You are the co-founder and CEO of Overlap Associates. And as I understand it, that's a problem-solving design consultancy. And you work with designers and strategists, engagement specialists, and other people here in Canada and the United Kingdom. So I'm looking forward to learning more about design, about your business, and anything else you have to share. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. And I'm in Ontario, and so I'm 3 hours ahead, and it's a really beautiful, sunny, wintry day. So I've been outside all morning with my dog and my kids and my partner out in the woods, walking around, hiking around, and it's been lovely. So it's it's not adventure necessarily, but it's it's being outdoors, and it's great. And I'm going to go back out this afternoon. So thanks so much for having me. I'm going to go through a few things today with you folks. I'm going to tell you a bit about me and just my sort of career history, just to give you a sense, since you are predominantly business students, and I'm told that that would be interesting for you. But then we're going to talk about why design thinking or human-centered design, and why this for us is the underpinning of the work that we do and what can happen when you apply this way of working. And then I'm going to talk about how we practice. And I know you're in a design challenge. I believe, if I'm correct, you are currently iterating on prototypes, and you've been doing design research and all of these things. But I'm going to talk about some of the steps you've already been doing, but try to ground you in the way that we think about how we practice this work and what that looks like. I'll tell you one quick story about a project that we did, again, just to bring this to life a little bit, and then we can do some Q&A. So that's me facilitating a session, but workshop with the group. And the before times, obviously, we do everything virtually these days, which is great. We used to do a lot of stuff with sticky notes and in-person workshops in this work. But sort of my career journey and business journey, Overlap is 10 years old. Which we're very proud of. And we've been doing all sorts of interesting work. As Michael said, we've got a studio in the UK as well that we opened in 2018. But before all of that, the beginning of this whole story, I was always an entrepreneurial guy. I grew up on a farm with my grandparents, and farms are really businesses, and there's a lot of stuff you get to do, and there's a lot of fixing things and just doing stuff, and you live where you work, and you kind of have a different way that I think you think about work and life when you grow up on a farm. So the to-do list is just one big to-do list, and everyone has to get everything done. All through high school, I would start little businesses, and I salvaged computers and rebuilt them and sold them. And I made furniture at one point. I wanted to make all this modular furniture. So I was always creative, and I don't know, I like making stuff and doing stuff. When I was in university, I went to Queen's and I studied sociology. And in my first year, I ran out of money, and I went to my grandma and said, "Grandma, I ran out of money. I need some more." And she said, "Well, sweetie, that's not how this works. You're going to have to get a job." I was like, okay. So in high school, had worked part-time as well at a jewelry store, had befriended the goldsmith, and he had taught me how to do some minor repairs. I could do a little bit of metal work, enough that I could make some basic jewelry. And so I decided I would start designing and selling jewelry, and that's what I did. And that's how I paid for school. So I would make jewelry, I would get into the stores, I would do little pop-up shows in people's homes, and sold this jewelry. Actually ended up getting invited to Toronto Fashion Week. I did that, but I had done all of this just to make money to pay for school. Like it wasn't, and it's because I had a skill that I could monetize, and it was creative and I liked it, but it wasn't like I wanted to be a jewelry designer. So I ended up stopping doing that when a mentor at the time in my life said, "Hey, Brock, you've done this whole thing and you're clearly creative. Maybe you should study design because that might be interesting for you." And I was like, cool. So I really loved making packaging. And so I decided to study graphic design, did that, but it was there that I bumped into design thinking. This idea that you can apply a design process and a design method to other types of problems. And I had studied sociology in university, and I really cared a lot about societal problems, these big, messy, complex problems, and thought, well, maybe there's an interesting way to work on those using this method. So I kind of got excited about that. Where can I do that? Nowhere, as it turned out. Maybe I could go to the States, but there was really nowhere in Canada. And so I ended up working in traditional advertising and graphic design shops for the early part of my career, always experimenting with this design thinking thing that I had bumped into and had become really interested in. I eventually ended up as the creative director at a print graphic design firm in 2008 when the financial crash happened of 2008, 2009. And the firm that I worked at had been around for 30 years. And all we did was print graphic design work, which was a perfectly fine business at the time. We did high-end annual reports and corporate brochures and internal signage and all of this sort of stuff. And it was interesting work, but it was gone when that recession happened. And so we pivoted that business into doing sort of programmatic education with our clients. So they had new problems that they hadn't experienced before. They had to cut back on their budgets, but they were willing to try to invest in new skills development. And we're seeing that this time around coming out of this economic recession as well, that we need to reskill people. We need to get our folks working differently. And we went to our clients that we had longstanding relationships with and said, look, you've always talked about wanting to be more, your staff to be more entrepreneurial, to have more ideas, to come to work with a fire in their belly to solve problems. That's how we work in design. So why don't we teach your teams how to work this way? We'll come once a week, we'll work with a cross-functional team. And so we started doing these sort of design learning programs inside these companies and worked on all kinds of really neat things and saved that business effectively. So it was a very successful pivot. After 2 years, the marketing work had come back. We tried to buy that firm, myself and my business partner, couldn't get a deal, and we started Overlap. And because when you leave a job where you have a good employment contract on their side, then you have non-competes and things like this. And we just didn't want to deal with any of that. So we gave up all of our for-profit corporate work and went entirely nonprofit, public sector, societal problems, which was kind of getting back to what I was originally interested in years and years ago. And so we started working with charities and healthcare systems and education systems and governments and cities. And then we started doing corporate work again. And it's just been a really interesting journey through that time. So that's a bit of how I've ended up doing this work. Again, as I say, Overlap is 10 years old. And now we have three parts of this business. We have our design consultancy, which is the main and the biggest piece of the business. We have an education piece where we teach about design thinking and creativity and how to solve problems using different methods and techniques. And then we sell design decks, card decks, and process cards and different tools to support people in their problem solving. And those are the three parts of the business. So it's been really fun. It's really interesting. It's really different. If you've got questions about that, we can do that at the end. But this was one of the first projects that we did with Overlap back in 2012. This was a need statement that came out of design research we were doing when we were working in a healthcare system with a hospital, specifically one of the bigger hospitals in Canada. And they wanted us to come in, and we were doing a project on patient experience. So what is the patient experience happening within our walls, within our community, within the system? and how might we improve that, and how might that feed into some of the strategic planning that the organization was doing. And what was interesting as we did that work, as we talked to people, patients and families and frontline staff all through, all through the hospital, this statement kept coming up around wanting to feel dignity in death. And it means something different today in the context of right to die legislation, but at the time, people were talking about the experience of dying, and people die a lot in hospitals, which is just the part we don't talk a lot about. This is the thing that people wanted, and they wanted to die better. So when confronted with this statement around needing to feel dignity in death, the administration of the hospital, which drowns in data, but is thirsty for insight. In healthcare, we measure so many things. We do so many patient satisfaction surveys, and we ask people, if they felt included in their care, and if the staff were nice, and if the room was clean and the food was okay. But we never asked people to rank out of 5 how scared they were. We never asked people to rank how dignified the experience was, or when they were lonely, or when they were confused. We don't ask those questions, and so we don't report on that data, and then we don't try to do any sort of intervention there. And I think we don't ask because we're not exactly sure what to do with it. But because when we do design research, as you folks are likely have experienced, and as I understand it, you're doing some surveys, but also interviews. It's when we have those open-ended questions, the qualitative questions that really allow us to explore what's happening in a space, that these kinds of moments emerge, where when confronted with, I need to feel dignity in death, the thing that we designed was a no one dies alone policy, where anyone from the administration to the cleaning staff were empowered to sit with someone and hold their hand and be with them if you realized they were in their final moments, so that they wouldn't die alone, so that they would have a more dignified and less scary death. And that was absolutely transformative for them. It was a huge insight in the process, and it has resulted in something that has really deeply and meaningfully impacted not just the lives of the people that are obviously passing away, but also for the people around them, because it's created a new way for them to even talk about this. And I think that for us, this is why working this way is so important. When we get outside of the assumptions that we make about the problem that we're trying to solve, when we give ourselves space to explore that problem really fully, and we talk about falling in love with the problem, we find really incredible opportunities for, in this case, this was a lot of, this was social innovation for them. A much less heavy example, but same hospital, we were chatting with someone in the emergency room who'd been waiting for a long time. And again, in healthcare, we're fixated on wait times. Can we get wait times lower? How we can get people through faster? And if you can shave 30 minutes off a wait time, it is an incredible feat, typically of lean. They have done something incredible to get someone through 30 minutes faster. But from a patient's perspective, what is substantively different from a 5-hour wait to 4.5 hours? Basically nothing, because while I waited, that's where the real, again, opportunities are for designing a better service experience. We were chatting with a guy, he had nicked his hand with a saw. He had been building a deck. It was the hottest day of the summer, and he needed to be there, but you're gonna wait a long time for that kind of thing. And because it was the hottest day of the summer, he had been wearing a t-shirt and shorts. And so he's come into an air-conditioned waiting room, and by the time we're talking with him, and he's waited for hours, the guy was freezing. And so when we're talking to him, he said, look, I'm grateful all of the things that we all say about our healthcare system. He's like, but I don't know who to ask, about like where I'm at and how long it might be. I don't want to bug them. It seems stressful in here today. It took me a while to get my seat. Like, it's really busy for whatever reason. He said, but my biggest problem is I'm cold. I need a blanket, and I don't know who to ask. And I need a blanket was another sort of rallying cry and this really interesting insight for this hospital, because they realized, oh my God, we're fixated on the wait time, which maybe we can do something about and maybe we can't. And we've completely ignored anything that improves the experience while we wait. It's the million things that happen while we wait that make the wait so awful, in addition to the time. And so if I can't fix that, could I at least make it better? In that particular instance, there's lots of people that are cold, waiting in an air-conditioned emergency room to see someone. So How do we get blankets into the emergency room? It's far more difficult than maybe it needs to be. But again, that's fine. Once we realize that was the thing, then we can design around that and make that self-serve, and how do you get them cleaned and all of these sorts of things, but make that wait time better. So again, for us, these are some of our favorite stories about this, because in both instances, it wasn't necessarily a big technology that was the solution, although sometimes that is. It wasn't some big expensive implementation that really required a massive shifting of resources. They were deeply human insights about an experience that someone was having that maybe we would ignore otherwise, and have remarkably human solutions around, in the case of the No One Dies Alone policy, just basic humanity and compassion and kindness. And in the blanket example, caring about people's comfort while they're waiting for a relatively minor set of stitches. So that's why we think working this way is so powerful. When we talk about the process, this is how we talk about it. I think you folks are talking about design thinking. It's the same idea. Human-centered design is the way that we talk about it. These are often used interchangeably. I think design thinking, which is really, again, this gets at all the same things. It's the way that we're approaching that work. I think when we're talking about human-centered design, we're often talking about the process of it, but let's just use them interchangeably for the sake of our chat today. So when we do it, these are the 5 stages that we use. I think maybe you're using one of the Stanford models. They're all basically the same. Some of them have 5 steps, some of them have 7 steps. Anyway, this is how we do it. So define, research, ideate, prototype, test. And those 5 stages, we draw them in a circle. Again, trying to emphasize this idea that the process, of course, isn't linear. It's something that we cycle through and you bounce around in. But of course, we talk about it in a linear way because that's how we engage with things. But when we do a process like this, when we're thinking about a project and how we're going to scale it or scope it, we generally break our time apart sort of in this way. So the defined set of activities, we will spend 15% of our time on. Research, 20% of our time. Ideation, coming up with the ideas, just 10%. Because if you've done your research and you're engaging in this process, the ideas are happening all the time. So you don't need to spend lots of time there. Ideas are easy. Prototyping, 30% of your time, because it takes longer to make stuff. And then testing 25% of the time. And that's how we scale our project. So if I only have a week to do a project, I'm going to break my week apart roughly in that way. And if I have 6 months to do a project, I'm going to break my project roughly apart that way. And it means that I'm putting the right emphasis in the right areas. It also helps clients understand how we're going to spend our time and where the emphasis needs to be. Prototyping tends to be, especially in a lot of the spaces that we work, where we're working on service prototypes, or we're working on business models, or you're working on things that are a little less tangible. The idea of prototyping is often more difficult for those clients to kind of get their heads around, but there's so much magic and power in the prototyping. And again, I believe you're iterating on your prototype. So that's fantastic that you're making stuff and getting feedback on them is such a unique part of this process. And again, it's how we end up with solutions that actually work for people. We know that we're solving the right problem because we did the work up front, and we know that we're solving it right because we are testing all along the way. Now, when we're actually doing this work, it looks more like this. This is a process map. If it's of interest, we'll send you folks a bunch of links for, after your design challenge, so you can continue to have some references. So we'll send that to Michael after today. But this is our process map. And again, it's just a way to give people a sense. It doesn't always follow this flow, but it's trying to reinforce the idea that there are decision points all along the way, and there are questions we can ask. And really, this method of working, especially when we're working on complex problems, it gives us a way to take the next step. We don't get stuck just doing the same thing or worrying that we don't know enough. It's not perfect yet, so we can't move forward in our process. We will never have done enough research to know for certain that the solution is going to work if the solution is truly new or novel or innovative. So we have to keep moving through the process, but you want to ground it all in some good research. It's just the research isn't going to tell you if it's right until you actually keep moving through. So this kind of gives you a different way to think about how do I ask that next question, or how do I feel confidence to take the next step? So the 5 steps. So I just said it wasn't linear, but I'm going to take you through it in a linear way. So we do typically start in the define phase. And we do typically start there, even if it's just with a general problem. So how might we improve the patient experience at this hospital is a really great invitational question and problem statement. It's remarkably broad because we didn't know that the dying alone piece was a thing that was critical to that experience until we went in and did the exploratory research and dialogue and conversation. So something like that that's really open is a really nice way to get started. And again, that's enough. You can go from there and go start talking to people to start informing your understanding of the definition phase, that problem space. And so when we talk about doing this, really what is critical in the define set of activities is not that that's the problem statement and we never revisit it. You are doing a lot of this work to learn more about that problem, to learn more about possible solutions. And so we will loop back to that problem statement and change it or iterate on it. Or sometimes we're building out big problem maps where we're looking at root causes and symptoms and bubbling up a set of insights about the problem that then steward the rest of our research and ideation. And it's that coming back to the problem and revisiting it piece that is really important in this work. And again, I think it kind of gets lost sometimes because we get so excited about moving through and getting to our solution. Many aspects of the problem are still there. And so it continues to be useful fodder, and it continues to change the problem as you introduce new solutions. So again, depending on the work that you're doing, it's useful to go back and just ask, are we still solving the same problem, or are we kind of in a different facet of that problem? I talked a little bit about complex problems, or I at least mentioned it. And this way of working is really, really useful when we're working on complex problems. Brenda Zimmerman, who's passed away now, but was an academic at, I believe she was at York. She was part of Social Innovation Generation, which was a big social innovation initiative that went on for 10 years in Canada. A bunch of universities were partners in different organizations. But she talked about the difference between simple, complicated, and complex problems. And so I think it's useful when you're thinking about what kind of problem am I working on, and is this a really good method for that? So simple problems are things like baking a cake. There's a recipe, you need to follow that recipe. And if you follow all of the steps and measure everything properly, you will produce a cake at the end. You can mess that up. So it is, it's a little bit tricky. But if you follow the recipe, generally you can produce a cake. There's a little bit of skill in there, blah, 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 but basically follow the recipe, make a cake. Complicated problems are things like getting to space. So the recipe is just a lot bigger, and you need a lot more people with a lot more education and a whole bunch of factors that have to go right. So we've got weather issues, and we've got technology issues, and we've got all the things that go into that. But if we follow that recipe and conditions are perfect and everything goes the way it's supposed to, we can get a rocket into space and back again safely. That's a complicated problem. Complex problems she says, are things like raising kids. So I'm guessing that most people on this call don't have kids. I have 2 daughters. And I think for those of you that are students and have siblings in particular, then maybe this resonates. If you are a student with a sibling, did the same thing that motivated you to do something your parents wanted motivate your sibling in the exact same way? And the answer is probably not. I cannot get my kids to do the exact same thing with the exact same input. And that's really what a complex problem is, when the inputs don't produce the same outputs. And that is often at play when we're dealing with humans. So all of the factors that impact my decision to engage in some sort of risky adventure tourism, which Ross was talking about, 2 different adventure seekers, there is an intrinsic set of motivators there that make us want to go do those sorts of things, but there might be slight differences. And so we could create different personas of our early stage adventure tourism seekers. And it's those differences where, again, we can unlock a lot of really important information about how to design solutions. So really not just putting people in one bucket, but looking for the differences and the nuance is really a big part of it, especially when what we're trying to deal with is complexity. Design research. Oh, sorry, and I should just mention invitational openers. Often we will use an invitational opener when we have our problem statement. So how might we improve something, or wouldn't it be nice if? And we do that because there's something about optimism in this work that I think is really important. You have to believe you can solve the problem. And you have to invite people in with a belief that we can solve this problem. And that doesn't take away from the severity or gravity sometimes of these challenges, but there is something we think about, a mindset of optimism. We call it practical optimism, and inviting people into the space. And especially if the problem is really, really challenging or it feels impossible, you got to create a little bit of hope that you can do something about it, because it's too hard otherwise. And so wouldn't it be nice if those kinds of questions create the space for people to come up with ideas and explore these problems and solutions. And again, that idea that we're going to learn more as we go, and you got to really keep that in mind. All right, the design research piece of it. So we do our design research. We put a big emphasis on actually talking to people. So again, as I understand, I think you folks have been, which is fantastic. I sometimes participate in design challenges where the research was all sort of theoretical, and we were empathizing because we were trying to think about those end users and what they might want from an experience, but they didn't actually talk to anybody. And there's so much power in just sitting down and talking with somebody. So we will do a mix of quantitative and qualitative data gathering and analysis. We find that quantitative data in particular points you in the direction of a problem, maybe tells you that there's something there, but it doesn't tell you why. And so engaging in qualitative activities like interviews or observational research, those things help you understand why something is the way it is. And when we understand why something is the way that it is, it gives us more ideas for how we can make it different or how we might improve it. So going and interacting with the people that actually face the problem is super important. Asking experts to tell us how to solve a problem never helps us solve the problem, because they have all of their own biases and all of their own perceptions of the people that are the ultimate end user. So it's always about going to the people that actually experience the problem. It's being mindful of who that actually is. Sometimes it's a frontline worker that's the end user of that policy change, and maybe it's a service user that's the beneficiary of that. So we get into some complexity there, or some complicated pieces there when we're mapping these projects out, but it's who's actually affected or going to use the solution or is experiencing the problem. That's where we want to focus our design research. Sometimes we got to go where people are. Now, you're not going to do that right now in the context of a weekend-long design challenge. But if we're working with a population where, well, actually, I think your adventure seeker is a really interesting one. If we were doing this as a project, you would probably want to go and watch people in the space doing what they're doing, because there's all kinds of stuff that we do without realizing it. And so then we don't ever bring it up. It would never come up in an interview because I take it for granted. Well, surely everyone has to do this thing with their boot and their pant because, you know, how you keep your pant attached to your boot. And then you realize, oh, it'd be great if we just put a little hook on those pants, and then that would just keep the pants attached. Everyone's been hacking this, but we could just make a product that actually solves that problem. Or people not you know, engaging in a service in a particular way and kind of hacking that experience because the service isn't doing something that they need, and maybe we could actually be providing that to them. So sometimes observational research helps you see things that people wouldn't otherwise report. And sometimes, and in our work, we're working often with vulnerable populations that are not going to come to a workshop or are not going to answer a survey because they don't have access to the internet or a computer. And so we have to go to where they are. And I'll tell you a story about that at the end. It is about people's experiences. It is about, there's all the stuff that a client wants to know, and they want us to get rankings on stuff, and that's fine. But when we ask people open-endedly about their experience, there's so much magic in that. And a really great tool for that, and again, we can send a link for this after you might have used them in this design challenge. We love empathy maps for that reason. An empathy map asks you to tell me in the context of your, whatever it is you're doing, what are things you're thinking about? What are things you actually physically see? What do you find yourself saying to people around you? What are you actually doing in this experience? How do you feel, which is a really important question, and what are things you're hearing? And then sometimes we ask people about what they're trying to accomplish and why they can't and what they think would make a big difference. But those questions around thinking, seeing, feeling, doing, hearing, you get so much information, and we'll have people fill those out. Sometimes when we're doing design research, we will use them as well if we've been doing design research to fill in empathy maps based on what we're learning about folks. But it gives you so much, again, really interesting data and really interesting information about their experience, and not shying away from feelings. I think, and I find this with my corporate clients in particular, are so scared to talk about how people feel. And feelings is where we can make so much impact for people. We love it when people love our brand or love our company. And then we really don't want to talk about feelings if they hate it and they dislike it, because that doesn't feel as nice. But no one has a problem with love. Love we like, and then all the other ones are too messy for us, so we don't like it. So much power in emotions, leaning into those and thinking about, when we are looking at experience maps or service blueprints, how people are feeling through an experience is a really important part of creating experiences that really work for people. So don't be shy of feelings. And the last thing on design research, we talk a lot about loving the problem and falling in love with the problem and not your solutions. Your first idea is awful. It might be the right one, it's probably not. And we get so attached to our ideas and we will die for our ideas. And the ideas are not the important part. The problem is the important part. What problem for whom? So falling in love with the problem is about loving all parts of it, being curious about it, being interested in it, and wanting to spend time there. Caring about the people that are experiencing the problem and not being like, oh, well, they're just complaining. Loving it and thinking about what will we do for love. Love is such a powerful emotion. So we talk about loving the problem and really spending a lot of time there. And then actually the rest of the process, I think, comes a lot easier when you really spend time with that problem space. In ideation and coming up with ideas, there's two things that I always want people to take away from this. One is ideation is a quantity game. If you generate a lot of ideas, quality takes care of itself. Linda Carson, who is one of the members of our team, she teaches at the University of Waterloo on creativity and cognitive psychology, talks about the way to catch a big fish is to catch a lot of fish and throw back the little ones. Quantity over quality. And so one of the best ways to generate a whole bunch of ideas, and you folks can do this and you can apply this for the rest of your lives, start solo. When we are generating ideas, whatever your prompt is, whatever the question is that we're responding to come up with ideas, to have everyone write their ideas down solo first, just spend 2 minutes. Everyone try to write down as many ideas as they can in 2 minutes. If there are 6 of us and we all write down 10 ideas, in 2 minutes, we've got 60 that we're working with. In that same 2 minutes, if I'm trying to explain my first idea to you, probably I can't do it in 2 minutes, number one. Number two, I've just primed everyone with that idea. So we've lost the diversity of thinking. We've lost the diversity of ideas. And you want all of that. And so if everyone writes it down solo, you can come back to those lists. And so we can lose ourselves down a rabbit hole on a couple of them. And then we can come back and mine from the ideas we originally had before we all got primed. When we talk about priming, and again, the reason that we want to do this, if I ask you folks to spell the word air in the chat, most of you would spell it A-I-R. If I had talked about the Oprah Winfrey interview with Meghan and Harry on, I think that's today, I don't know, I see it in my newsfeed, and all the stuff about the royals and the rift between Harry and William and all of these sorts of things, and then the bullying allegations against Meghan and all the stuff, and then asked you to spell air, most of you would actually hear it as H-E-I-R because I primed you to hear the word that way. So that's why idea generation solo gives you more ideas, because you can't unhear something once you've been primed. So hilarious. I love the chat. I love the chat in these because you get totally different feedback, and it's the best. Anyway, and the last thing on idea generation, perfect's your enemy. Who cares? These ideas, these are all lambs for slaughter. You want a bunch of ideas that you can go test, and you want them to be wrong. You want them to be horribly wrong, because you're going to learn so much more from that. And so that's why we only put 10% of our effort into idea generation. It's not the first set. These are all probes into solution spaces. We're going to get feedback on those, and then we're going to actually get the ideas that are going to be great and really work for people. Prototyping. So you folks are doing some prototyping. I'm not sure what you're prototyping. I assume it's not physical things, but physical things is the easiest way for people to understand it. And then there's all kinds of ways that we can blueprint business models, services, experiences, etc. But I always show this picture of Wellbot. This was a robot that we were designing, coming out of a design lab that we were doing. Wellbot is a robot that is meant to travel to schools and talk to kids about their well-being. And when you create prototypes, they are meant to be rough. So this is obviously a piece of cardboard that's a real iPad that's precariously stuck into that piece of cardboard. And we were prototyping the physical form, but it didn't need to be anything more than the 3 feet tall that it was, because that was about the height of a little kid. And then a really simple user interface prototype. There's lots of different apps and stuff for that, because how it looked didn't matter. It was the interaction that we wanted. And we really wanted to see how kids would respond to the idea of a robot. That was the first thing we were testing. Oh, I love this chat. And so you're prototyping to test. You don't have to prototype the entire thing. You're actually building the thing that you want to learn more about. So I wanted to learn more about how a kid would interact with the idea of a robot. That was the first thing. So I just need the approximation of one. And actually, I want it to be really rough, because kids will fill in the blanks. Kids will give me feedback now about what they wish this robot looked like, what they wish this robot could do, because it was a slab of cardboard. And that's, again, what you're looking for. You're inviting people in now to the solution space with you. Sometimes you'll hear in these kinds of processes us talk about co-creation or co-design. That idea of doing it together is because I put out something that's not done, and I'm inviting your ideas in to make it better. And we're now creating together. And that's how you actually do that. Lots of ways to do this, but I'm mindful of time. And then testing and feedback. So obviously we're doing this all the way through. We're doing that with our ideas. We're doing that with our prototypes. And the more iterations we can get, the better. You want people to break your ideas. You're testing to break your idea. And one of the best ways that you can do this is to ask 4 simple questions. When you're sharing a prototype, ask people what they like about it, because no one thinks that that's what feedback is. And feedback is absolutely the things we like. Ask people how they would improve it, or what they would add to make it better. Ask people what questions they have about the prototype, which you do not need to answer in the moment. You're collecting questions as a way to shape your iteration. So why doesn't the robot have arms? We don't need to answer that question. We answer that question in the iteration. Does it need arms? Why doesn't it have arms? Is there something about arms that would actually improve this? So you're asking questions, which is a really nice way of getting negative feedback. Your idea is stupid and won't work. Gives me nothing I need to change that idea. Asking me a question about it, which begs an answer, gives me lots to work with when I'm doing iteration. And you don't have to ask hundreds of people when you're doing your feedback. And you folks are in a design challenge, and I think you're doing a bunch of iterations, so you're doing this now, which is great. Just ask 5 and get a bunch of feedback and do a bunch of iteration, and then go ask 5 different people and get a bunch of feedback and do a bunch of iteration. We're not trying to find absolute truth. We're trying to get more information by giving people new inputs so that we get different ideas about where to take the solution next. So really quickly, I'll tell you one quick story about this in practice. We do lots of work, as I said, in healthcare. We've done lots of work over the years in mental health and addictions related spaces. This is a very challenging space to do this kind of work in. You're working with very vulnerable populations. You are working with people that are street involved. They're not going to come to your workshops. You have to make things accessible. There's a whole bunch of stuff that has to go into working with groups like that. This was a project that was about improving the experience of these patients in that system. And through a variety of months and different parts of this project, which had us out on the street interacting with folks that were homeless. We were in soup kitchens and drug court. We went to people's homes or places where they lived. We visited people in parks at night. We had healthcare professionals with us. So this was all done with consent and safety and all these sorts of things in mind. But we went to where people were because to actually get to the most vulnerable, that's what was necessary. What emerged from this process was a policy brief, effectively, a policy standard or a service standard called dignity by default. That the thing that people wanted more than anything else from their experience in the mental health and addictions healthcare space was a feeling of being treated like a human being. And it was the stigma that they felt receiving service that caused them to not get service, which of course causes terrible health outcomes and societal outcomes for these individuals. What was particularly interesting was after that got implemented, so that was implemented in the healthcare system, a whole different kettle of fish to do that. Two other groups picked up the same service standard and said, well, wait a second, we also serve this population and we're not actually doing what they're asking for either. The service standard had things like treat me like a human being, but also be welcoming when I step through your doors, and design services that you would recommend to your mom. Because we kept hearing that people were like, oh yeah, that one's terrible. Well, why did we make something that we know is bad? So anyway, there's a variety of different things in it. But then the public library picked it up and said, well, we also interact with this population all the time, and we also can't actually deliver on this service standard in the way that we're currently set up. So they started hiring social workers on staff so that they could also then live this service standard and create a more welcoming and inclusive environment for this population with staff that were trained to be able to do that. And then the police picked it up, who also interact with this population a whole bunch in this particular community. And they said, well, this is really interesting. What does it look like for us to create a value of welcoming? That if you can't be out in the world anymore for whatever the reason is, what happens if we start thinking about this as coming into care instead of something that's adversarial? What if we thought about this as healthcare, not justice? What if we created a welcoming environment? And what do we need to do that? And that's been a longer ongoing piece of work that's been very interesting for them. But that people saw a way to apply this for the same group of people, again, has been transformative and ended up touching multiple systems, which was interesting, which was not the original brief, but this is what can happen when this work goes really, really well. So I'm not going to read that quote. So again, I just went through it in a linear way. You're bouncing around in these processes as you go. You're asking yourselves questions. You hit brick walls. And then you got to take the next step, and maybe you're backtracking, or maybe you're taking a side step. And we ask ourselves these kinds of questions in these processes so that we can navigate the process. As I mentioned, and actually some of them have been posted in the chat, but we'll send out some of these links again to Michael. This could be like a after your design challenge set of resources for those that are interested. We've got a really great blog post that's very popular for folks, called 75 Human-Centered Design and Resources Explained. Just a ton of stuff there, from physical tools, articles, books we like. It's a really great resource if this is of interest to you and you want to keep learning about it. Empathy map's been posted in the chat. Feedback grid's been posted in the chat. We can send you the process map again for those that are interested. And that is me.
Thank you so much, Brock, for sharing something of your own personal journey into design, and then also what you've learned over the years and how you've kind of distilled that into this process. I would, it was affirming because, you know, everything you were talking about is something that we're trying to do with the design challenge. And I'm sure that the folks here who are involved in the design challenge see a lot of the elements that we've been asking for in the design and the presentation showing up in your talk as well. I'm cognizant of the time here. So if you're still okay to hang out for a few minutes, maybe we'll open the floor to a couple of questions. I would ask folks to keep their questions short or comments short. We can see if we can get through a couple and see if we can get a bit more. And we'll go from there. Always takes folks a couple of seconds to get there.
Hi, Michael. I see a few people have raised their hands, and we can call on them if you'd like.
Sorry, they weren't showing up in my broad here. I'm going to, I think, Rithik, you're first on my list anyway. And if that's wrong, I apologize.
And you're welcome to unmute your video as well if you'd like. It's always great to see faces when you ask questions.
Sorry, my hair's a bit of a mess, showered earlier this morning. But I was going to ask, first of all, thank you for your presentation. It was really helpful. In terms of your problem definition, like simple, complicated, and complex, I kind of imagine like complex problems to have various inputs as to why they're being caused in the first place. How can you, are we allowed to design a problem that might tackle like one or two of those inputs? Is that okay for it to do justice to the actual complex problem? How should I approach that?
Yeah. So when we make, so as we're doing our design research, we will often build out a problem map, is what we call it. And so we are looking at, often we're looking at obstacles people face or why the problem exists. And so we will organize that. And sometimes we'll do that in workshop settings with, again, people that are experiencing that problem or other stakeholders. And we're often looking for relationships between them. So what you find that emerges are there are root causes and there are symptoms. And we are looking for ways that they are related to each other. We talk about it as almost building out a story. So this and this and this added together kind of point to something, and we give that a name. And so that gives us a container for this piece. Because again, we're never going to have every single element defined. So it's about creating clusters or themes related to that problem. And we will often also break out, this is a root cause or this is a symptom. And when you're designing something, you got to ask yourself, am I designing a cure or am I designing a Band-Aid? And I don't think there's anything wrong with a Band-Aid because Band-Aids stop bleeding. And sometimes that's what we need to do. Root causes are way more difficult to solve. And it requires a totally different effort and set of resources. And we have to know that's what we're doing. And I think it's better to be really upfront about what we're actually, again, what do we think we're actually designing here? When we're doing that work, we will often relate solutions back to that problem map. So we think that this thing that we're making gets at this and this and this in the map. And then we can see how one solution is connected back to that problem in a set of interrelated ways, if that makes sense.
No,
so it's just making connections.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thanks for the question, Rithik.
Hi, good morning. If I may, my hand was raised, but I didn't hear feedback. Okay, so just to follow up there, when the other guy just asked a question, my question was really in terms of if a problem was misdiagnosed, because you were given a problem, but somehow you probably classified it to be a simple or complex or complicated. It was misdiagnosed and you have formulated your strategies in kind of fixing this problem. How do you go back in terms of meeting a deadlock or a challenge? How do you pass that roadblock then? Do you go back and make strategies and recreating it, or how do you deal with that?
Well, and I think so ideally, this is why we're constantly working through that iteration or the cycle. So when we talk about the process of the work being one where we're going to revisit these stages, we're not going to be done our research phase and never go back and look at that information again. We're going to deliberately go back and plan our process so that we're going to revisit that problem statement. We do need to make decisions through the process. We do need to move on to the next thing. But when you're testing ideas, the ways in which your solution isn't working probably tells you something about the problem space. And that's a really good spot to, again, not just be fixated on the thing I made, but go back to that. Again, if you've built a problem map, what else are we learning about the problem? What's something that we missed? No one in all of our work so far talked about blank, but we only learned it because we showed them a thing, and then the big insight was revealed. So it's kind of, it's why we, you know, the work is really visual, and it's why we put an emphasis on make the map, so you can use these things throughout your process as you go. So it's really, it's that iteration, it's revisiting, it's bringing all of these pieces back, it's always making connections, it's asking what have we learned, and often when we're doing this work with clients, part of what you've set up with them is if we're doing it right, we are going to be revisiting, and we are going to take that step. We're not just going to pursue a solution that is not going to work, because that's where we're at this point.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Felicia. Maybe we have time for one more short question or comment. Brock, while people are just mulling that over real quickly, thank you so much for joining us today, and also for agreeing to share some of your resources. I know, I guess what I'm hoping is that, you know, some folks are actually thinking about the role that design might play in their futures, whether they're using it professionally or in some other context. This is, you know, part again of what we're trying to do with the challenge, right, is to inspire people and to think about what a career in business might look like, because there is just so many choices.
Totally.
So yeah, I think you've really given us a great, I think a great overview and a view into what this might look like. And your focus on what we describe as the interface between sort of organizational life and society, in particular, with your focus on mental health and healthcare, I think is just also really inspiring. So thank you very much. And I look forward to continuing to learn more. So
awesome.
Thanks. I'll stay on the line. I think it looks like there are people who are sort of signing off, and I know that folks have to jump back into their design process, because of course they have a hard deadline tomorrow with their final iterations. So I think we'll call that done. And I'm just going to highlight for folks, if you are interested in this design challenge and the process that you've been through, whether you're a student involved in the challenge or someone just dropping in for the presentations, make sure that you subscribe to the Design Thinking mailing list, because we'll push out information about next year's challenge and, of course, other things related to design. One of our deeper goals with this challenge is to build a design community in post-secondary education, and to have that community connected to the wider design community in Canada and across North America. So part of that is staying connected. So any opportunity that we have to do that, we'll appreciate.